When Alice Thomas died of arsenical poisoning in November of 1930, there were only two possible suspects. One was her husband, William, the other her friend, Annie Hearn. One of these two certainly murdered her. Yet in spite of police efforts, no one was ever brought to justice for the crime. So which one of them did it? When William Thomas and his wife, Alice, took a trip to Bude in Cornwall on the 18th of October 1930, it being a pleasant day, they brought along their friend and neighbour, Annie Hearn. Annie made sandwiches for the trip, and William drove to Bude, where they visited a café and had tea and Annie's sandwiches. Alice complained of having a peculiar taste in her mouth, and William bought his wife some bananas. On the journey home, Alice began to feel ill and vomited several times. On their arrival home, a doctor was called, and he decided food poisoning was the cause of her illness. He prescribed kaolin and a mild diet, and their friend Annie stayed over at the Thomases' house, Trenhorn Farm, to help out with Mrs. Thomas's care and to prepare her meals. After several days of illness and a brief respite, Alice became very ill indeed, and the doctor attending her, suspecting something more malign than food poisoning, called in another doctor from Plymouth. The second doctor confirmed his suspicions, and found her symptoms to be indicative of arsenical poisoning. Alice Thomas was immediately admitted to Plymouth Hospital on the evening of the 3rd of November, but it was too late. She died in the early hours of the 4th of November. The subsequent post-mortem found a substantial quantity of arsenic in her organs, and as there were only two people who had been in Alice's company during the period, her husband William Thomas and her friend Annie Hearn, it was quite apparent that one of these two people had murdered Alice Thomas. Annie Hearn was born Sarah Ann Everard in 1885 at Middle Raisin in Lincolnshire to Robert and Betsy Everard. Her father was a market gardener, and in 1919 she married a Dr. Hearn in Sheffield, who had died soon after their marriage. Thereafter Mrs. Hearn had carried a photo of her handsome young husband as her constant companion. She lived a peripatetic existence in company with her sister Lydia Everard, who was known as Minnie. Together the young women lived in Harrogate for a while, where Annie taught cookery, and then in the village of Wall in Somerset, before moving first to the High Street in Weston-super-Mare and then to Devon, finally settling in Luanic to live with their invalid aunt, Mary Everard. Annie took care of her aunt, who was confined to a wheelchair until her death in August 1926. Then, in July 1930, her sister Minnie, who was also apparently sickly, died too. Annie was alone in Trenhorn House, and occasionally took in a lodger or sold her pastries to help make ends meet. Her only friends in the area were her neighbours William and Alice Thomas, who lived less than 200 yards away at Trenhorn Farm. William Thomas had been born in 1889 into a farming family, and Alice, who was 2 years older than her husband, also came from farming stock. When the aunt and two sisters moved into nearby Trenhorn House, they became close friends. It was a period of hard times for the sisters, and William lent Annie £38 in 1928, about £2,500 in 2019 terms, which may have indicated that the friendship was a close and sympathetic one even then. After the post-mortem and other tests had clearly established that arsenical poisoning was responsible for Alice Thomas's death, there were only two suspects. If it was accepted that Alice had not taken the arsenic herself, then the other people who had access to her were restricted to her mother, Mrs. Parsons, another neighbour named Elizabeth Spear, who had not been in the house on the first occasion or immediately before the second, the doctors who had visited, and William and Annie. There really was no one other than the husband or friend who could have poisoned Alice. Local suspicions naturally grew, and at Alice's funeral wake, her brother, Percy Parsons, more or less accused Annie Hearn of poisoning his sister with the picnic sandwiches, glaring at her and saying, "This needs to be looked into," when he heard that she had made the sandwiches. William Thomas became cold towards Annie, and intimated that he would have no further need of her now. Then, on November the 10th, Annie Hearn disappeared. She left a note for William which read, "Dear Mr. Thomas, goodbye. I am going out if I can. I am innocent, innocent. But she is dead, and it was my lunch she ate. I cannot stay. When I am dead they will be sure I am guilty, and you at least will be clear. Tell them not to worry about me." In company with a police officer to whom he had reported the letter, William went to Annie's house and broke in the door. Annie had gone. She had abandoned most of her possessions and fled, apparently with the intention of committing suicide. A search for Annie resulted in the coat being discovered on a beach at Loo, and police suspected that she had thrown herself into the waters. But no body was found, and local fishermen who knew the tides and habits of the sea assured police that her body would have been washed upon the shore in the area. The inquest into Alice Thomas's death concluded that her death was due to arsenical poisoning, and its verdict was one of murder by person or persons unknown. Police learned from a chemist in Launceston, Shuker and Reed, that Annie Hearn had been supplied with weed killer in 1926, which was largely comprised of white arsenic. Doctors who had treated Annie's aunt and sister, who had died in 1926 and 1930, contacted police because their symptoms were remarkably similar to those Alice Thomas had suffered. Exhumations of both graves at Arsenic churchyard were authorized by the Home Office in December 1930, and tests showed that significant amounts of arsenic were present in both bodies. Police now believed that the quiet and demure widow, Annie Hearn, was responsible for 3 deaths, and they also believed that she was still alive. They issued descriptions of Annie Hearn to the press and a photograph, and the case received widespread attention. The Daily Mail offered a reward of £500 for information leading to her capture. In spite of this incentive, the police had little success in their search for Mrs. Hearn, although one further intriguing piece of information about the wanted woman was learned after the appearance of a photo of her husband in the Daily Sketch. It quickly emerged that the man in the photo, whom she claimed was her dead husband, Dr. Hearn, was in fact the great-grandson of the Marquess of Londonderry, Lieutenant Charles Stuart Vane Tempest, who had died of his war wounds during March 1917. It was discovered she had purchased the photograph from a shop in Sheffield sometime in 1919. No record of a marriage to anyone called Hearn or to a man of any other name could be found. It added to the bizarre portrait of the character of Annie Hearn, and served to increase press interest in the case. Meanwhile, in January 1931, some 60 miles away at the coastal resort of Torquay, an architect, Cecil Powell, lived with his wife in a large Victorian house. They had a housemaid come domestic servant called Mrs. Anne Faithful, a bespectacled lady with dyed hair, whom they had employed in the previous year, and who came highly recommended from a doctor and his wife in Exeter. Mrs. Faithful was an intelligent and well-educated widow in her late 30s, and the couple held her in high esteem. She was efficient, hard-working, and an excellent cook, They were altogether delighted with their employee, who was quite personable and attended church each Sunday. Then, in early January 1931, Powell discovered that some of their old newspapers had had cuttings of articles taken from them. In Anne's room he discovered a cutting of a woman who was wanted by police for murder. The woman was Annie Hearn. Mr. Powell noticed the similarities between Annie Hearn and Anne Faithfull, and he contacted the police and communicated these suspicions to them. After discreet inquiries and surveillance, Cornwall police stopped Anne Faithfull near the house on the 10th of January and asked her whether she was in fact Annie Hearn. She initially denied this, but upon being taken to Torquay police station, she confessed to it. She was arrested and brought before magistrates at Launceston Police Court and remanded in custody, charged with the murder of Alice Thomas. Large crowds gathered in the January rain to catch a glimpse of Mrs. Hearn, who by now, it was understood, was neither Mrs. nor Hearn. Her appearance was brief, merely to confirm her name, and when the charge was read out to her, she made no reply. She made an appearance before magistrates in March for the committal hearings, and here she was charged with the murder not only of Alice Thomas, but of her sister Minnie on the 21st of July 1930. This caused a sensation. Her solicitor, Walter West, argued that the only evidence the prosecution had against her was that she had opportunity to have committed the murders, but nothing more. The magistrates disagreed, and Annie Hearn was committed for trial to be heard at the Bodmin Assizes in June that year. To their credit, Cecil Powell and his wife maintained their belief in Annie, and having claimed the £500 reward offered by the Daily Mail for information leading to Annie's capture, they promptly put it to service in securing the best legal defence for her trial. The trial of Annie Hearn began on the 15th of June 1931, before Mr. Justice Roche, with Norman Birkett appearing for the defence, and Herbert du Parc for the Crown. At the opening of the trial, two important decisions were taken by the judge, which were to have a major impact on the trial and its outcome. The first of these was whether to permit a personal diary of Annie's deceased sister Minnie to be admitted in court as evidence. This was denied, although excerpts from her diary relating directly to her beliefs that she had been poisoned had hitherto been heard at the magistrates' court in March on a restrictive basis. The second was whether evidence that Minnie had died of arsenical poisoning could be heard by the court. This was allowed, although the charge of murder against Annie in respect of her sister's death was to be considered only after the initial verdict concerning Alice Thomas was given. The prosecution case was built on medical and forensic evidence which related to the victim's death by arsenical poisoning and on when it had been administered, with a view to proving that it was after eating some of the sandwiches prepared by Annie Hearn at Bude that Mrs. Thomas had become ill. Also that Annie had purchased white arsenic powder in the form of weed killer some 4 years before Alice Thomas's death, and that her sister had similarly died from arsenical poisoning just 3 months before Alice's death. According to the prosecution, Annie's subsequent actions of faking her own death, her disappearance, and other suspicious conduct supported this. Expert witnesses in the form of Dr. Roche Lynch, the Home Office pathologist, the doctors who had attended both Minnie and Alice Thomas were called to show that both women had been found with quantities of arsenic in their bodies, and that both had shown signs of such poisoning prior to their deaths. The defence countered the Crown case by contending that Minnie's body could have been contaminated by arsenic as a result of the high levels of arsenic occurring naturally in the Luanic soil, possibly during the process of exhumation. Alice Thomas, they said, had in fact died of a severe case of food poisoning. The sole evidence against Annie Hearn was that of opportunity to commit the murder of her friend, for which there was no possible motive beyond the merest speculation. Annie Hearn spent 4 hours in the witness box being grilled by the prosecuting counsel on her actions and proved a clever and competent witness. On the final day, the judge summed up for over 4 hours and put the matter squarely. There were only 2 persons who could have administered the arsenic, he said, Mrs. Hearn or the husband. After they had retired for nearly 1 hour to consider their verdict, the jury of 10 men and 2 women returned and gave their verdict as not guilty. The Crown then dropped the case against Annie Hearn in respect of the second charge, that of murdering her sister Minnie. But the question remained, who killed Alice Thomas? The first point to address here is whether the matter was one of murder, or, as the defence claimed, was a case of food poisoning. The defence successfully persuaded the jury that Alice Thomas had either died of food poisoning or that there was sufficient doubt on this point to induce them to return a not guilty verdict. But in practical and forensic terms, this is almost impossible. Not only had she exhibited distinct signs of peripheral neuritis associated with arsenical poisoning, but she had shown the progressive symptoms of it during the period of her illness. The evidence relating to Mrs. Thomas's death was also supported by the tests carried out on Minnie, which, by the quantities of arsenic found in her hair, showed that she had been poisoned with increasing quantities of arsenic over a 7-month period before her death. Turning to the question of how that arsenic was administered to Mrs. Thomas, the options are limited. 1. That she took it herself. 2. That it was administered to her by her husband. 3. That it was administered by Annie Hearn. 4. That another visitor administered it to her. And 5. That it was administered to her by Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Hearn together. Of the visitors who had access to Alice during the period of her illness, none were present before or during the onset of either illness, and so can be discounted. So we are left with 4 options, and if we are scrupulous enough to include Alice herself as a possible source of ingestion on purpose for some unknown reason, then it must quickly be seen how impractical on the one occasion and improbable on the other this was. As a means of suicide, as has been observed in countless other cases of arsenical poisoning, it would be painful, prolonged, and uncertain of outcome. The access to such poison would have been problematic on the second occasion and bizarre on the first. The reasonable assumption must be that poison was administered to Alice Thomas either by William Thomas or by Annie Hearn. No other possibility exists in this case. No evidence was or can be evinced for any other possibility. As Judge Rose said in his summing up, the issue is down to 2 people, Mrs. Hearn and Mr. Thomas. As the husband of the victim, William Thomas had the clearest motive for killing Alice Thomas. He acknowledged to Annie after his wife's death on the 4th of November that they were both suspects, and chiefly her. It was clearly becoming apparent to him after her death, as soon as the suspicion of poison was mooted, that it had to be either him or her. He had almost the same opportunity to poison his wife as Annie did, being the only other person present on both occasions on which poison must have been administered. But in his defence, the occasions which Mrs. Thomas was taken ill both coincided with the presence of Annie. He would have had almost unlimited opportunities of poisoning her, or killing her by other means, had he wished to do so. Of course, the usual witnesses came forward after the event, generally decades later, to claim that William had other women, that William and Annie were lovers and met secretly. It is difficult, without the benefit of police corroboration or contemporary accounts, to regard these as anything more than manufactured wisdom after the event, community innuendo to provide explication of an unresolved drama. There is no evidence that William and Alice were lovers, or that there was gossip to this effect at the time. There is, of course, a world of difference between gossip at the time and gossip that occurs after the fact. The first is relevant, the second is not. There is also a practical objection to William's being the poisoner. It seems clear that the first poisoning of Alice Thomas took place on the 18th of October. On that occasion the three friends had visited the seaside resort of Bude and went to a café together. Owing to the speed at which arsenic acts on its victim, it would be expected that Alice should become ill in a matter of 2 to 3 hours at most. The journey to Bude began at 3 p.m. and the sandwiches were consumed around 5 p.m. At this point Alice appeared to be in good health. She exhibited the first signs of illness around 7 p.m. If she had taken arsenic before she left home, then it seems not to have been producing any effects at all by the time they reached Little John's café, or even by the time they started out for home, at least 4 hours later. In fact, it seems to be an inescapable conclusion that the only occasion on which she could have consumed arsenic was at the café. Here they had tea and cakes, and Annie's sandwiches. It is difficult to see an occasion on which either William, or for that matter Annie, could have introduced arsenic to Alice's food here. If it is accepted that the arsenic was not in the tea or cakes, which would surely be too inexplicable and random for consideration, then the sandwiches were its source. William Thomas had no access to these that is known, did not in fact know of their existence before Annie produced them at the café. When Annie produced them and Alice took the first, she had taken the second, and William the third, by her own evidence. She alone could control the order in which the sandwiches were eaten and by whom. There is one final point concerning William, his conduct. There is a clearly discernible alteration in his manner towards Annie throughout the period. Initial gratitude to a friend gives way to a certain gruffness and abruptness, as she termed it, after his return from the hospital when his wife had died. At this point there are suspicions, but nothing has been demonstrated concerning the use of arsenic. His manner becomes testy with her, confrontational. They'll find out if she has been given anything. He is telling her here, if you have done anything, then you are going to be caught. It's as close as it gets to an accusation, because that is essentially what it is. His suspicions are gathering like a dark, impossible cloud on a sunny day. He still can't believe them, because she has been a devoted and close friend. But he knows the doctors are dissatisfied, has been told that day that his wife's organs are going to be sent off for toxicology assessment. His mind is working. He tells Annie gruffly that he will no longer require her now. When she says she will go home, he says, "As you please." His terseness speaks of what is forming in his mind, even as he struggles against it. Of what the judge subsequently laid out before the jury. One of them did it. Usually when a murder is committed, there is only one person who is absolutely certain who the killer is: the murderer themselves. In this case, as there were only two possible suspects, two people knew without doubt who the killer was. The person who was the killer, and the person who knew it was not themselves. The innocent person shared with the killer an absolute certainty as to who had committed the murder. As William Thomas did not know for certain yet that his wife had died of arsenical poisoning, merely that it was suspected, he was not yet in this position, but his mind is moving understandably towards this conclusion, and it shows in his behaviour towards Annie. Once the toxicology reports confirm she has been poisoned, he knows absolutely who the murderer is. At the trial, he has become a hostile witness towards Annie Hearn. His anger and contempt can be felt. The conclusion here must be that although William Thomas had a theoretical motive and was present on both occasions on which Alice was poisoned, he had no practical opportunity of administering the poison to her, and all the other circumstances seem to suggest that he did not. For these reasons, too, it is highly unlikely that he and Annie were co-conspirators. The other person who could have murdered Alice Thomas was, of course, Annie Hearn. As regards her motive, we are in the weak position of speculation, because Alice was, as far as is known, her friend, and any imputation concerning a relationship with William Thomas suffers from the same defect that has already been observed. But there is compelling evidence for suggesting Annie Hearn was the murderer. First, the only known occasion when poison could have been administered to Alice Thomas on the 18th of October was during the stay at Little John's café in Bude. Here the sole items consumed were tea and cakes and Annie's sandwiches. Given the previous observations concerning the tea and cakes, it seems almost a certainty that the source of the arsenic was the salmon sandwiches. The ease with which the colourless, odourless, and tasteless grains of arsenic could be introduced into a sandwich was demonstrated in court. Second, as Annie made all of Alice's meals after the 18th of October up until the 29th of October, when the second dose was administered, she had ample opportunity of introducing further poison to Alice. Anyone else preparing a meal for Alice would have been conspicuous given this arrangement. But none is known. It seems clear, then, that Annie Hearn had abundant, if not exclusive, opportunity of poisoning Alice Thomas. Third, the evidence allowed by Justice Roche concerning the death of her sister Minnie 3 months earlier was important. It may be questioned how useful it was to the Crown at her trial, because although it gave clear evidence of system if proved, it tended to diminish the prosecution case somewhat if it was disproved or doubted. The testimony of the expert witnesses was shaken by accusations that contamination of the exhumed bodies with arsenic could have occurred naturally due to the content of arsenic in the Luanic soil, although the Home Office pathologist Roche Lynch described this possibility as extremely remote. A clever barrister like Norman Birkett was able to augment this so that it played on the jurors' minds. The medical evidence relating to Minnie's illness was uncertain, given hesitantly by the doctors who had attended her, and caused only doubt as to whether her death was in any way related to that of Alice Thomas, or was even not due to natural causes. She had been ill with her stomach, was a sickly individual, and even though the forensic evidence of the increasing quantities of arsenic in her hair showed very persuasively that she had been poisoned for 7 months up until her death in July 1930, these other factors were sufficient to induce doubt in the case. Nevertheless, it is difficult not to conclude that Annie Hearn was indeed the murderer. Apart from the circumstances relating to the death of Alice Thomas, The death of her sister Minnie in July 1930, just 3 months before the death of Alice, was so similar in terms of its symptoms and the arsenic quantities found in her organs, hair and nails, that it would be perverse to suggest it was natural. Every other circumstance of Minnie's death gives cause for concern. The likelihood of 2 such nearly identical deaths from arsenical poisoning, occurring in the same area, in the same exclusive presence of the same person, Annie Hearn, are remote. The death of the aunt 4 years earlier, and whose body also contained quantities of arsenic when exhumed, was not used in evidence. It had been 4 years earlier, and opportunities for contamination with natural arsenic obviously greater. She was also acknowledged to be an elderly and frail lady of 76, whose death caused no great surprise. But although it could not be used in court, there is something to recommend its consideration at an observational level. Her symptoms were similar to those of Minnie and Alice. The exhumed body revealed quantities of arsenic similar to those of Minnie and Alice, and, perhaps importantly, her death occurred at the same time as Annie first purchased arsenic from Shuker and Reed in August 1926. This may have been a coincidence. Coincidences occur, but such coincidences extend to her sister Minnie, whose death mirrors that of her aunt in many respects, except her age and state of health. The prosecution was right to exclude the aunt's death from the trial of Annie Hearn, because it is straying into depths which would have further harmed the case. Yet these similarities, the parallels between the aunt's death and those of Minnie and Alice, the high quantities of arsenic present in all 3 bodies, mount in a common-sense consideration of Annie's guilt. There is one final point which should be made concerning Annie Hearn and the case for the murder of Alice Thomas and her sister Minnie. At the beginning of the trial, the prosecution sought to have the evidence of Minnie's diary admitted in court. Birkett, for the defence, was adamant it should not be allowed. The judge decided it was inadmissible. It is unfortunate that this diary has not survived, because the only reason the prosecution would have wished to include this is because it was helpful to their case, either by alluding to a motive for why her sister Annie would wish her or Alice Thomas dead, or for revealing insights into her sister's character or mentality which might be detrimental to her defense. But in spite of the efforts of the prosecution to secure its inclusion to the trial of Annie Hearn, the judge ruled that it should not be disclosed. At the Magistrates' Court in March, during the committal proceedings, Patrick Devlin was permitted to refer and read from parts of the diary which related specifically to her symptoms. These are very restrictive, unfortunately, but are suggestive nevertheless. She speaks of the medicine she is being given by her sister as poisoning her. She says she can feel it entering her hands and feet. "It is too strong for me," she said. A doctor treating her gave evidence of her saying she felt the medicine was poisoning her, to which her sister Annie, who was present, hurriedly interceded. She constantly complained of feeling worse after receiving the medicine. A neighbour, Mrs. Spears, spoke of Annie giving her sister emergency medicine, which the doctor had given her to treat her sister, she said. But the doctor denied he had ever prescribed such medicine for Minnie. What else is recorded in Minnie's diary is unknown. Annie Hearn was an odd character. She was intelligent and well-read, gave the appearance of being highly educated to the extent that a man such as Cecil Powell and his wife could judge her to be a superior and educated woman. She had a certain charm, too, because she was well-liked and trusted by those she came into contact with, and it is clear that Mr. and Mrs. Thomas were captivated with her. They took her to Bude on their fateful day outing with them. They had her stay to look after Alice during her final illness. Annie Hearn was a personable and trusted woman, but she was also a woman with a dark side. She possessed a cold, pragmatic ruthlessness combined with intelligence and deceit, a fascination with doctors and death. Early on, she had cast herself in the serviceable and tragic role of the young widow, perhaps as a result of seeing and envying so many young widows spawned by the Great War. During a period in Harrogate, she conceived of, romanced, and married Dr. Hearn, killing him off within a short while, and purchasing a photograph of a dashing young aristocratic war hero to grieve over. This charade was played out to her friends and family, and to all she subsequently came into contact with. Living a somewhat itinerant life in company with her sister Minnie, she travelled from boarding house to boarding house, and their means of occupation is unknown. In 1926, they settled with an invalid aunt in Luannick, in Trenhorn House. She appears to have had the same affection for and trust in Annie as the Powells did, and the Thomases too. They lived here more or less in harmony until 1926, when the aunt died. This may have been of natural causes, or it may have been by Annie's hand. It is possible that she resented having to run around after the old woman, and also that she wanted to take in lodgers, and could not do so while the old lady took up half of the house. She certainly purchased Weed Killer on the 4th of August, 1930, and her aunt died within 3 weeks. That may be coincidence. She may have bought arsenic to remove weeds around the garden, as she claimed, or it may have been for a malign purpose. The Thomases were neighbours, and Annie enjoyed a close friendship with them. William Thomas was a handsome man. It is not difficult to imagine that Annie would have been enamoured with the rugged farmer, and he would quite naturally be flattered by her attentions. He took both sisters out for drives in his car, separately and together. He told the court that he bought them a newspaper every day during the year prior to his wife's death. Annie clearly believed that William and she were a match. But there were 2 obstacles to this match. The first was her sister Minnie, sickly, dependent on her, preventing her from running a boarding house, which had long been her ambition. The other obstacle was Alice. Did Annie believe that she and Thomas had a romantic relationship, thwarted only by their circumstances? Of course she did. She told the arresting police sergeant in Torquay that Mr. Thomas brought her the newspaper each day. Of course that was just a blind, she confided. Her letters to her elder sister, Mrs. Postick, recounting the illnesses of her sister, are filled with references to Mr. Thomas. The judge alluded to this curious fact in his summing up. Minnie's stomach ailment became considerably worse in early 1930, and by the summer she was very ill indeed. She died on the 21st of July, and the doctor gave her cause of death as gastric colitis. Once again, it is possible that Mr. Thomas's role in their lives and Annie's infatuation with him is recorded in Minnie's diary, which has been lost. Where else does one confide such matters? If so, it will tell a tale of a quite fanciful and one-sided passion which grew in 1930 until Minnie became ill. She recorded these early symptoms of arsenical poisoning in her diary until the pages fell silent. Annie resented her sister, her illnesses. It became an affront to share William Thomas's visits there to exchange pleasantries, or to help with some chore the ladies contrived for him. Her sister was no longer her companion. She was an obstacle. If Annie had removed the inconsequence of her aunt, then she knew she could do the same with her sister. And she did. After her long and painful illness, which must be attributed to arsenical poisoning, her sister, clearly entertaining suspicions of some sort, died. Annie no doubt acknowledged the deepest sympathies extended to her by the Thomases, and of William attending to her needs now that she was, in effect, thrice bereaved. Of course, he would do what a man in his position could do to help her. There may possibly even have been a dalliance, or a flirtation at least, but if so, it would have been of small consequence to him. Annie was no femme fatale, and she had odd disconcerting habits of walking clumsily with her head on one side. She didn't look people in the eye when speaking to them. She was an oddity, and it is unlikely William Thomas would have entertained any serious feelings towards her. William was probably sincere in his efforts to help Annie. But in those 3 months following her sister's death, Annie must have exulted in her sole possession of William Thomas's affection. Her ever-active imagination conjured a new life for her as the wife of William Thomas. It was the stuff of her daydreams and probably consumed her nights as well. But there was an impediment still, of which she was painfully aware. William Thomas was married to Alice Thomas, and Alice Thomas was neither sickly nor in her care. On the 18th of October, when William invited Annie to spend the day at Bude with himself and his wife, it was surely an act of kindness, in recognition that she seldom, if ever, went anywhere or had any means of doing so, that since her sister had died she was very much on her own. But Annie's perspective was somewhat different. The occasion provided an opportunity which was not an everyday occurrence, an opportunity which must be taken. There would have been few or no such occasions when she could control the food both her neighbours ate. That was a unique opportunity for her, and she took it. She introduced a few grains of arsenic into the topmost sandwich. It was very easy to control who had the top sandwich, because it would be the person to whom she offered it. It was the most natural thing to offer the first sandwich to Alice, as the only other lady in the company, to take the second for herself, and to then offer one to William, who would accept this order as a matter of social etiquette. And that is precisely what happened by her own account. Alice took one sandwich, she took one, and then William took one. She must have watched Alice closely until the sandwich was gone, and then waited, knowing her work was done. Because although it was subsequently ascertained that Mrs. Thomas had received a second dose of arsenic on or around the 29th of October, her death was quite inevitable after the first dose was given. It would normally take between 2 and 3 weeks for the poison to destroy the nervous system of an adult woman and result in her death. In Alice's case, it took 17 days. After a short while, Mrs. Thomas complained of a strange taste in her mouth. It was a sure sign that she had just ingested some strong poison. Although she didn't know it, she was already beyond help. Her death was assured. Annie must have known very well at this point that the arsenic had started to run its inevitable destructive course. William bought his wife bananas to take away the taste. Then gradually Alice started to feel unwell. On the way home she became violently sick, and by the time she had arrived back at Luanic, she was extremely ill. The doctor quite naturally suspected food poisoning and recommended a mild diet of egg white and water until the symptoms had passed in a few days. Annie probably expected Alice to die from the poison she had laced the sandwiches with, and would have been satisfied that the doctor had attributed her illness to food poisoning. She had not the luxury of administering small, regular doses, as she had with her sister only 3 months before. But Alice didn't die as quickly as her frail aunt had, after being given a single dose of arsenic. She was a robust woman, and it would take time to do its work. and in the course of the next few days she seemed to show signs of recovery. That must have alarmed Annie. Then she took a turn for the worse. On October the 29th she became very ill again. So alarming were her symptoms that the doctor was called, and as soon as he saw her, he knew she was not suffering from food poisoning. The symptoms were those characteristic of peripheral neuritis, which strongly suggested she had been poisoned, almost certainly by arsenic. He called another doctor from Plymouth, Dr. Lister, who immediately confirmed his colleague's suspicions of arsenical poisoning. At this point Annie must have been in a state of some alarm. The doctor's hushed consultations over the patient, the alarming technical terms, their obvious concern. A sharp woman like Annie Hearn would interpret these correctly. There was a problem. The doctors inquired as to what Alice had eaten and drunk, may have inquired whether arsenic was present in the house, and who had prepared Mrs. Thomas's meals. Mrs. Thomas was rushed to hospital in Plymouth, but died the following morning. Annie believed that the poisoning of Alice Thomas would prove as straightforward as that of her sister and aunt had been. But that belief turned out to be wrong. The doctors saw the signs of arsenical poisoning, and her death led to a post-mortem. When William Thomas returned with the news of his wife's death and the post-mortem, he was entertaining a suspicion he could scarcely believe. His wife had been poisoned. That was clearly what the doctors were intimating to him, and he knew that only he himself and Annie could have done this. He was brusque with her. When he said, "If she has taken anything, they will find out," it was not a statement, it was an accusation. Annie knew this. She was a clever woman, and as soon as Alice's illness became a matter of suspicion, she also knew there were only two people in the frame. She had taken a risk because she had to. She might not have another chance. On the evening of Alice's admittance to hospital, Annie realized she was in grave danger. The following morning Alice Thomas was dead, and a post-mortem and tests proved what only Annie Hearn knew for sure. Annie prevaricated, uncertain what she should do. At the funeral wake, Percy Parsons accused her of poisoning his sister, stating that the matter of the sandwiches should be looked into. William avoided Annie. Rumour was rife. The police were now on the trail, and Annie took flight. She left a note for William Thomas, a parting endearment, which he promptly gave to the police. She realized that any notion she had had of a union between them was gone, and William's promptness in soliciting the help of the police suggests his innocence. He must now have been all but certain of her guilt. Annie wasted no time. She was infinitely resourceful. She took a taxi to Loo, and here she deposited her coat on a beach. She had brought a Mac with her, it seems, which she now put on. She caught the train to Torquay, forged a glowing reference for herself from a doctor in Exeter, dyed her hair, and acquired spectacles. She was now Annie Faithful, housekeeper, recent widow, and devout churchgoer. After the trial in Bodmin, Annie Hearn was driven away from court, and the large crowds of spectators who had come to see its denouement watched in silence. They were deceived, though. Before leaving court, she had exchanged clothes and even spectacles with her sister Bessie, and she left unnoticed. She was escorted by a reporter of the Western Mail in an open sports car to a secret location where she gave an interview. Her sister Bessie left court dressed as Annie, and the crowd were fooled. It is doubtful that many amongst the crowd believed Annie Hearn to be innocent. She never returned to Trenhorn House, and went initially to stay with her sister in Harrogate. Here she changed her name and then moved elsewhere, disappearing from public view. No one knows what became of her. William Thomas was the subject of rumours concerning himself and Annie Hearn in the after years, of a relationship between them, but there is nothing contemporary to the events of 1930 to support these tales. Others took the view that if Annie Hearn was innocent, then he must be guilty. The judge had said as much in his summing up, and this was a natural consequence of her acquittal. He became embittered, moved to Braddock Lostwithiel, near Bodmin, soon after the trial, and farmed here alone and somewhat reclusively until his death in December 1949.